Hi, everybody. Later in this episode, near the end, we talk about the Blue Heaven novel writing workshop, and I mentioned the heroes of the revolution who took it upon themselves to edit more novels than were absolutely necessary. After recording this, we recently learned that the foremost of those heroes of the revolution, Chance Morrison, died this fall. So, wanted to dedicate this episode to her.
Welcome, everybody. This is Mohanraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans, and I'm Marianne
That's
Mohanraj.
what we keep saying.
That is, yes. That's the claim, and we're sticking to it.
I don't know. I think you may protest too much.
Yeah.
We are totally humans. We do human things that humans would do. Those are the things that we do.
Is that your
Not
show
at all
slogan?
that we need to keep saying. Yeah. And I'm here with my co-host, Benjamin Rosenbaum, and our temporary co-host, Jed Hartman, who we have now dragooned into several episodes at this point. And we're going to talk about editing, and I'm going to try and keep us on topic today. So
we've been stringing Jed along on the theory that we're going to be talking about editing, and thereby making him an involuntary co-host for the past series of episodes.
Yeah, I'll keep coming back as often as you want me, but I would like to talk about editing at some point.
So Jed has more editing experience than either Ben or I, so he's our expert witness today. Maybe a quick recap for everybody about what we actually have done as editors. So Ben, you want to start us off?
As I have done the least. Tumbarumba, A Frolic of Intrusions, was a very strange project that I think we mentioned before that my conceptual artist friend Ethan and I did, which looked like an anthology on the back end and a broken web browser on the front end. And I also did a little bit of, I think maybe there's some other things I'm forgetting. There was a thing where that I did with a bunch of cool people. 23 small disasters. Christopher Barzak and Hadar Copley Woods and a bunch of people. Anyway, that we published at Idiomancer. But I've not done a lot of editing.
I was actually thinking about like the kind of game design workshopping that I've seen you do. I was like, can I make an argument that that's editing? Like you do an RPG, we run it as a, sort of a beta test and give you feedback. And then, it's revision more than editing, but because
that's really I'm the creator and you're workshopping. That's more like workshopping a story, I feel like.
Yeah. I guess.
I don't know. It's not really me. When I think of editing, I think of you being in the role of, like as a critiquer, you're, working with somebody else's story and making it better. And as an editor, it's that, plus you have the final say and you're the interface to the outside world and you're, acquiring it and you have some responsibility beyond just this is my thoughts.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's fair. I won't stretch it as far as I think.
Marianne is, for those who don't have video, Marianne is glancing up towards the top of her screen as if feverishly constructing an argument.
Okay, I'm not going to. So you do also have lots of experience being edited. So so we can talk
by Jed for one.
For one, right?
You a little.
My experience editing is complicated, right? Because often, like I had the title of editor-in-chief for various magazines that I founded. So Clean Sheets, and then Strange Horizons, and then Jaggery. I did almost no fiction editing for any of those. But I did set parameters and guidelines initially. So especially for the first two, Clean Sheets and Strange Horizons, like what kinds of things are we looking to publish? I was part of those very, very early conversations that helped set an initial shape for the magazine. But then I think the editors kind of took it wherever they wanted to take it after that. But I guess I wanted to mention it because I feel like that is a piece of editing that doesn't often get separated out, because so often the the people who are actively editing are also the ones doing the shaping of what the thing is. And it's a little odd that I've done one piece and not the other for a lot of these. I have edited some anthologies myself. So Best of Strange Horizons, we did 1 year. So I edited that. I edited, I should have prepped for this by looking to reminding myself what I've edited. I edited a WisCon Chronicles Volume 9, I think it was, conversations around intersectionality. And that was a mix of fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. I was a consulting editor on 2 volumes. One was one of Jim Hines's, I'm going to blank on the title. His anthology is about diversity in science fiction, and I want to say Invisible is in the title, and I'm just so not remembering, and I'm sorry, Jim. But he did the bulk of the work. I was just sort of like a secondary kind of consultant check kind of thing. I also did similarly for Herotica 7, which was a crash and burn situation. Marcy Shiner was the editor on that. I was consulting editor. And the stories we submitted, the press was so politically uncomfortable with, I think it was one of them. There were a couple that made them iffy. They ended up canceling the book and canceling the series from that point forward as a result. So,
yikes.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting editorial moment.
Yeah.
And then most recently, JJ Pionke and I, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, sorry, JJ, co-edited Survivor for Lethe Press, and it's a science fiction fantasy stories of trauma and survival. And that just came out a couple of years ago.
It is called Invisible.
Yeah.
It is called Invisible. Oh, good. Yay. Hey, Invisible 3, I think it was. There were a couple in the series, and I came in for the third one. And I may be forgetting something. Feel free to remind me, Jed, if you.
Aquaerotica?
Oh yeah, I am forgetting. Good Lord. Yeah, that's.
Well, you said some anthologies.
Well, but that's the one that sold the most. So I edited Aquaerotica and its sequel, Wet, which were 2 erotica anthologies for Random House that were printed on waterproof paper and sold like gangbusters.
Because there are a lot of mer people who really don't have enough smut. And this was a breakthrough for them.
Well, I'll give you 2 anecdotes from the editing of that book. One was the person who wrote in saying they had tried spilling various things on it, including red wine and so on, and the pages had held up very well. So, thanks for the product testing.
Research.
Yeah, an honest person. And the other was the little old lady, self-identified as such, who complained that, the pages were infused with sort of like a little plastic that made it feel like art, like heavy art paper. It was kind of glossy, and the book was heavy. It was very fabulously transgressive to go and hold it under a faucet of running water. Yeah. The book is fine. And
like a magic trick.
The biggest thrill, right? Was doing that. But she wrote in and she complained that the book was too heavy to hold one-handed. And so for an erotic,
well, that's why you can submerge the book to the bottom of the bathtub.
Yeah. Yeah. We actually don't recommend submerging it for long. We did do a test because we came up with a display method. I felt very proud of myself because I came up with this, but I didn't think they could actually do it. But in the sort of publicity meeting in New York, they had me in, I think, as a courtesy. And I said something like, it's a shame we can't ship them with fish bowls so they could display it sitting in water. And the PR people got this light in their eyes. And they're like, well, actually, and they did. They found these foldable plexiglass fish bowls that plexiglass, foldable plastic, I guess. I don't know. But something that they could ship with it. Maybe they had them made. I don't know. But it made for a great display. And the book's was in its 4th printing within 4 months and sold masses of copies. And I, of course,
I'm telling you, mer people.
And I was a baby editor, and so I had only gotten a flat fee and not royalties. And so I could have bought my house years earlier if only I had had a good agent on that one. We'll talk about agents.
You didn't realize, but this coincided with the opening of the first branch of Barnes & Noble in the Marianas Trench. And so there was a...
It ended up being a very popular beach book. People like being able to take it to the beach and like not worry about it getting wet. So,
Yeah.
Very relaxing. Anyway, Aquaretica and Wet. I edited those two. I feel like I edited another one too, and I'm blanking. Anyway, so yes, anthologies. I've done a bunch of anthologies, which is very different from magazine editing. And I will turn it over to Jed to do his intro.
I wanted to touch on something that you said in passing earlier, that that the editor-in-chief role is sometimes pretty different from the editor role. And I think that often editor-in-chief is used as a synonym for publisher, for what I would call publisher, although that gets tricky. Anyway, my editing has consisted mostly of my editing of stuff that's being published has consisted entirely of being a fiction editor on Strange Horizons for 12 years. There was a period of a few years when I had more experience as a fiction editor for an online prozine than anyone else in the world. But eventually the Clark's World people passed me after I've been away for a while.
Those bastards.
Yeah. So you also edited for Constellation Press. So
well, but that's a very different thing so far. I hope to publish anthologies in which I will be doing largely the same thing. But
right, but you're putting up books, and I guess you're not asking the authors to change any of the prose on those books. So maybe
mostly, yeah. I mean, so I can go into that later. But so far, so I mean, there's a difference between an acquisitions editor and a developmental editor, and I gather that in the good old days they used to have copy editors and proofreaders as separate jobs as well. And so at Strange Horizons, my job was a mix of acquisitions editing and developmental editing and copy editing and proofreading. And I think that traditional editors would be perhaps horrified at mixing those very different jobs, but that was what we did.
Have copy editors?
Yes, there were proofreaders who did a final proofreading pass on everything. But in at least for my stories in fiction, and I think the other fiction editors too, we were aiming to be completely done. We sometimes got a couple of things from the proofreaders, but I considered proofreading to be part of my job.
I mean, Strange Horizons was also an online volunteer endeavor, so it was like the kind of environment where lots of roles would be mixed and fast on the ground and startup-y.
Sure, yes.
But I've definitely, I mean, like I definitely feel like it's not entirely gone. Like I've still gotten separate notes from proofreaders to copy editors. I mean, when all of the stories in the Ant King had been published and proofread, I mean, save one, had been like published and gone through whatever process, but like there was a whole lot of like a whole other level of minutiae that came back from the Spellbeer press, like about, and where Excellent. I was like, oh, I guess I don't know where to put colons or parentheses, you know what I mean? Like, you know, like I was just like, really? I'm learning things about, you know, edge cases of, you know, punctuation. Anyway.
Well, it's interesting. And I certainly am still, when I have books with the bigger presses, I certainly am still dealing with separate copy editor, proofreader people after.
I'm glad to hear that. That's great.
Yeah, no. That's still happening. And sometimes it's a little disturbing. Like when we were doing Tremontaine, I was co-writing Tremontaine for Serial Box with Ellen Kushner's project. I want to say it was Juliet Wade who was copy editing on that. And she brought a level of thoroughness to that job that I had never encountered before in, 20 plus years as a writer, and was, often not quite every sentence that I submitted, but many of them, she would suggest revisions. And it was fascinating. Like I generally approved them because they made it stronger. There's a little bit of a sense of like, is this even my prose anymore at the end of it, right? Like she made the whole thing cleaner and stronger, and but not quite the way I would write anymore. So which is interesting, right? Like, I mean, what is the copy editor's job in that at that point? So,
I mean, I find that interesting, the relationship with copy editors, where it's like, it's very much their role is to make this correct standard English. So usually, like, so often I'm like, oh, that's good, that's better, and also to make it tighter and cleaner and whatever. But often, given the way I write, where there's often a voice or a character, I was like, no, that's wrong on purpose. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of that, right? So
she was very good at it. So like I like it was a sort of like, I look at what she suggests, I hesitate, I'm like, no, I guess it is better. Okay. And like but it was a very slow process too, because I had to like push past my own barriers every time. So for every sentence, so it was like, no one else has edited me that heavily. So
I would say that all of the different forms of editing are art rather than science, and there's an enormous degree of variability both in editorial preferences and in sort of how far to go. So the other editor-like work that I did for a publication was that I was a proofreader for Clean Sheets. And that was mostly because, if I remember right, I saw a couple of pieces that went live with typos in them, and I said, can I copy edit? Sorry, not copy edit, proofread. I had a co-proofreader who was also excellent, and we were pretty much on the same page. We were mostly complicated due to name change. Where was I going with that? Oh, just that we were pretty much on the same page in terms of not making big changes. We were correcting typos. We were adding punctuation if it was clearly necessary and clearly missing. But I'm pretty sure that at that point we were not working with either the author or the editor. We were the last stage in the process, and we were, we would tell the webmaster make these changes. And I was a little uncomfortable with that. Like, I didn't feel like we should be doing that without input. With Strange Horizons, I was doing much more extensive suggestions, but I was working directly with the author. And going back to what Ben said earlier, we had an explicit policy that the author had final say on everything. I think that some authors may have not really believed that, or may have given in on things that they didn't really want to because they were worried that they would get unpublished, which I know a lot of beginning authors get concerned about. But we did explicitly and repeatedly tell them, this is your decision. What here, I may as well say what my philosophy of editing is, which is that my job as an editor is to help the author say what they want to say as well as possible.
I do think maybe it's helpful to go back to the different types, because I think clarifying acquisitions versus developmental is useful here. Because when you're doing the acquisitions editor job and you're deciding whether to take the story or not, there are kind of three options, I think. Either you're not taking it, you're taking it, or you're possibly taking it depending on whether the author can revise it to something that you want to buy, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, I don't know that everyone's familiar with those as options. So I just kind of wanted to lay them out. So typically, like, if I were editing for an anthology, the bulk of what I read as submissions, I'm going to reject. I don't have, I've got 20 slots. I get 600 submissions. Obviously, I have to reject most of them. There's going to be often, honestly, I'm sort of hoping that I'm going to have 20 perfect stories that I don't have to do anything to, and I can just be an acquisitions editor and then publish them as is, and my job is done, right? Because I think I don't love the editing process so much. I actually love acquisitions, and I love bringing out wonderful things. But the actual editing process is a lot of work. In Survivor, for example, I would say that at least 18 of the stories, maybe 19 out of the 20, we took pretty much as is, maybe cleaned up a couple typos, a little bit of a grammar choice here or something, but with almost no changes. And there was maybe one or two that had more serious developmental work. And I can't remember for that anthology, but I have had, I think, like for Aquarotica, I remember, it was Aquarotica, there was a story by Nisi Shawl that was submitted fairly early in her career when she was a newer writer. And there was something I really liked about it, but it wasn't working. And I wrote back to her and I said, I really like this, but blah, 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 blah. I can't guarantee I'll take it. But if you'd like to revise and resubmit, I'd be happy to look at it again. Yeah. And she did that. And then I said, well, this is better. And then I actually kind of said the same thing. I can't guarantee I'll take it. Yeah. Submit. And she did. And then I did it one more time. It took us 4 hours, right? But I love the story that we ended up publishing. And it's interesting. Like, I think many writers would have given up before that, right? Like, to have an editor over and over say to you, yeah, it's not there yet. Go do this work and maybe I'll take it, maybe I won't, right? Like, a lot of people would just give up and walk away and say, I'll find an editor who appreciates my genius. Right. But I hope Nisi feels that the end result of what we were able to build together was a story she was really happy with. So
what we did with Strange Horizons was to have an explicit policy that we would not buy a story unless we were willing to publish it as is. So that policy developed out of a couple of unfortunate experiences. But
can you talk about that?
Perhaps better not.
Okay.
I guess the short version is that we agreed to buy a story a couple of times. We agreed to buy a story with the expectation that during the editing process, we would fix the things that we felt were wrong with it. But that ran afoul of the author gets final say policy, and the author said, no, I don't want to change those. And it went badly.
You weren't happy with.
Yeah, I mean, there was the authors ended up, I think in all of those cases, the authors ended up being flexible, but they ended up being more flexible than they were happy with. And we ended up being, making fewer changes than we were happy with. And it didn't go well. In one of the cases, the author did say, what I was reminded of this by what you said about, the proofreading process, that, they felt like the changes that I was proposing made it no longer their voice. And I was particularly chagrined by that, because I thought that was something that I was especially good at, that I'd been praised for by other authors, who said, wow, you've really helped me sort of bring out what I wanted to do here. And that was my goal. So after that particular one, I stepped back and started softening my language and my suggestions, and maybe making fewer of them.
I laugh because, having been edited a lot by Jed, there was definitely, like, I guess I definitely got post this experience, Jed, because there was a lot of what we had a word for this on an earlier episode where we were talking about this. Yes, tentifying. There, yes, yeah. that you definitely were like, if you thought it would be useful, perhaps.
Yes. and I think a lot of the time authors read that as reasonable, because without that language, they felt like they were being ordered to do something. And
it's probably very useful in that
criticized.
case.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is important to stress and underline for, because sometimes we're sort of addressing newer writers or whatever. I think that's something I would, one of the few things that I would very much want to bring across is that there is a drastic difference, like what you're saying, but there's a drastic difference between pre-acceptance and post-acceptance editing.
Yes.
Because pre-acceptance editing is a negotiation and post-acceptance editing is a suggestion. And it's, obviously more comfortable if you're doing, I mean, I love revisions, and we had lots of back and forth, and I think a really good like there's certainly a school of thought that's like, well, I'd like clean copy and I hope I don't have to touch it. But like there's also something lovely about a partnership where you're actually like, where it's actually like I mean, if you have the time and inclination, like to have the connection that you're working on the story together, and a good editor makes your story better because they, but obviously that's much more comfortable to have that interaction in the context where the author has the final say. And that's pretty much universal in my experience, that like once it is, at least I have acted that way and it has paid and it has played out that way, which I encourage everyone to simply assume that this is the case, because I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, that once they've said, yes, we will take this story, but I have some notes, that's a yes. Like, as opposed to, I'm interested in this story, would you consider making these revisions? Then I'll look at it again, which is a no. Like, it's kind of either a yes or a no. Both of those sort of sound like a maybe, but one is definitely a yes, and the other is definitely a no, and we can talk. You know what I mean? It's not like a no is not a no forever, but it's a no. So, like, you know, which is not to say don't like do what, you know, like what Nisi did is what you should do. If you're excited about, if you think their suggestions are good, why wouldn't you make them? And then if you still want to be published there, why wouldn't you send it in again? So that's great. But it's really useful to have the clarity of being like, oh, you said yes. So now that makes me much more willing to consider all of your suggestions, because it's just like we're playing together, coming up with the best story. But like, I don't feel like it's going to get, you know, yanked out of my hands and turned into something else, because at the end of the day, I have the final say. That's a much more comfortable process. But the other process is also good, where you're trying to get them to yes, and you're like, okay, I revised it. Do you like it now? But then you know, the expectation should not be like, there are two failure modes here. One in which they've said yes, but you don't really believe them, so you're not willing to actually, so you're making changes you don't want to make. And the other failure mode is where they've said no, but you're kind of hoping it's a yes, and then you're really disappointed when it's not. So, like, you know what I mean? I feel like the clarity is useful.
I mostly agree with everything you just said, but I do want to note that there are way more than two failure modes. And
yes.
That in an extreme case, Marianne introduced me to the concept of a kill fee, where the editor pays the author and decides not to publish. And
sure.
I think that's
somewhere between 10 to 30% of what the.
I think that's an almost worst case scenario. I guess worse would be they don't pay you and don't publish it.
Yes, or they ghost with your story, and
right.
Whatever. There's plenty of terrible scenarios.
Just to clarify, like, kill fees, you know, are a fairly standard thing in magazine publishing, and I think evolved in part because, especially with nonfiction, there might be lots of reasons why 3 months down the line it no longer makes sense to publish this article, right? And so it's like, it's not that you don't like the article anymore, it's just no longer right to bring out in the January issue of the magazine, you know, because the world
also in nonfiction. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's it. I was just going to say, like, for nonfiction, there are lots of reasons where you might pay a kill fee. I think less so in fiction. In fiction, but usually something's gone catastrophically wrong somewhere.
Well, I mean, there's also a difference. There's also another category, which is, have they seen the whole thing? Because in short fiction publishing, it is typical that they are reading the entire story. So then, for them to say yes and then kill fee it, they would have to drastically revise either their perception of the story, or they, you know, something happened. But in nonfiction magazine writing, and also in book publishing, people often sell on a proposal. So all they've seen is a synopsis and maybe a pitch. Maybe for nonfiction, all they've seen is a pitch. And
I don't think you usually use the term kill fee then. It's just that it's like, so this happened to me with my novel at HarperCollins, right? That what happens when you sell a novel is you usually get some percentage on signing, another percentage on of your payment on delivery. Manuscript, delivery and acceptance, right? And then the final chunk on publication. And so, for example, for that book, I think I had a $60,000 advance, and it was $25,000 on acceptance, which is all I ended up getting, because even though I gave them a manuscript 4 months later, and then we spent 4 months going back and forth in revision, they decided not to publish it. And so they did not accept. So I didn't get any more money from them. And I got to take the book away and try to sell it elsewhere. And if I had, I would have had to pay them back the $25,000 out of the new advance. So, so it's not the same as a kill fee, right? Like
Sure. No, I mean, in that case, it's sort of already built into the contract. The contract already has prearranged like milestones at which, but I think I don't know. I mean, I haven't done a lot of nonfiction magazine writing, but I think that, often they haven't seen the whole thing. We need to get Megan McCarran or somebody in, but they often haven't seen the whole thing until like it's literally, a week from go live or something.
Even with fiction, I ended up writing for for Penguin. I did this book, Catherine in the City, which was a choose your own erotic adventure, and I got paid a flat fee, work for hire, to do this 40,000 word, essentially a choose your own adventure novel. And it was supposed to be paired with a book by Michael Hemmingson, and so we both got paid we got paid on signing the proposal, right? And then they didn't like what he handed in. I think Mike is a great writer. I love his prose. I was excited to see his book, and I don't know what he gave them. Somehow it didn't mesh up with what they were envisioning. So I think they paid him a kill fee, and then they asked me to take his outline and write the book. And so they end up spending more money because they had to pay me, and they had to pay me more because I was doing it in 3 weeks instead of 4 months. And I injured my hands doing it, so I wouldn't recommend it. I wrote like 40,000 words in 3 weeks, and it was a lot. But it was an interesting kind of complicated situation, right? Where he got paid something for his idea, and in fact, if you look at the book, The Classics Professor, it has his name on the cover of the author. And then if you open it, it says story by Michael Hemmingson, written by Marianne Mohenraj on the title page, which I don't know how unusual that is. It was unusual for me. Maybe there's a lot of that in certain kinds of fiction writing, commercial writing, where there's more collaborative work. I don't know.
So can I go back to another thing about magazine things? I wanted to note that there are also different editorial cultures, and my impression at the time, you folks would know better than I about current practices, but my understanding at the time was that in general, in science fiction short fiction publishing, there was essentially no editing done after the story was accepted. That in general, it was, there might be proofreading, but the story was expected to be essentially ready to print when it was accepted. And in the early days of Strange Horizons, one of my then co-fiction editors before we launched, it said, "That's how I want to do things. We should not accept any story that isn't ready to publish as is." And I was a little dubious about that. And then that editor left before we launched, and I changed policies. But for example, is it okay to swear on this show?
Yes.
The story that I was told was that a friend had a story published in Realms of Fantasy and was asked to change only one word. It was because at the time, Realms of Fantasy made the first word in the story big. So, you turn the page and the first word would be, and the first word of the story was fuck. And so Shauna asked this writer to move that to the middle of the first line instead of the first word of the story.
I have a very similar story, although it wasn't that it was going to be published big, but I did actually once have, I think, Charlie at or maybe Gordon Van Gelder at the time, at Fantasy and Science Fiction, I think it was Gordon Van Gelder, tell me to have me remove a fuck. I think there were like 3 in the story, and he was like, just the first one, it's a little too much. And really, it wasn't even that it was framed less as like, this is jarring and the context doesn't work, but more as like, we have some readers who they don't like the language. And I was like, this is like a story where post-human robots are fucking all over the place, but you're objecting to the word? And that was very alien to me. But then I actually remember at some point reading some older science fiction reader and talking to him, and I was like, oh yeah, no, I totally get that. Like, you're fine with like there being post-human robot sex. It's just like the word is jarring because you didn't grow up with people slinging it around. I don't know, like, it, you know what I mean? Like, it was just like, no, it just seems really loud, but it's not the content. It's just the, anyway, but that was
my kids watch these TikTok videos, right? And since we're all at home all the time now with shelter in place, I'm hearing a lot more of it than I usually do. They're full of swearing, right? And
right.
we don't swear in my house, right? Like none. Kevin doesn't swear. I don't swear. The kids don't swear. Basically at all. We're not good at it. We're not practicing.
We're not good at it. That's the best reason.
All the more reason to get the kids experience.
I didn't tell you this. Like, I feel like because at one point in high school, I tried to, so I grew up in a nice immigrant Catholic Sri Lankan household. Where
you did tell me this.
Absolutely couldn't swear, right? And like, I tried to swear in high school, and my friend told me to stop because I didn't do it.
Everyone was like, "No, you're not. You just go back to the way you were." It's very funny.
If you'd let me, I can't even put a swear in. I was like, I can't. But what I was going to say is that I find it very jarring, and I do actually find myself saying to the kids, like I'm not saying they can't watch these videos, but I'm like, at some point I end up saying, I don't love hearing that, and they'll often like switch to another video. Cubby was explaining to me that in order to get to the content on this, she had to listen to this same thing over and over again. I want to hear it, but it was just the way the TikTok was set up, and she was trying to get to the end point. I don't know. And I was like, I send them away to another room. My old ears can't take it. So
we could have a no swearing version of this podcast. We could be like, if you prefer a bleep version, see our website.
When I taught in Utah, this came up, right? Because I was teaching a lot of Mormon students who at the time weren't allowed to watch R-rated movies. And so if we assigned one, like I was doing a section on fairy tales and had them watch Pretty Woman before writing their essay about fairy tales, they had to watch the edited version, which they could get from Brigham Young.
Wow.
Which had the line "Cinder fucking Ella" had the fucking bleeped out, right? That was the objectionable bit in that movie, which is all about prostitution, right?
Sure,
like,
it but it's the words, not the content. That's very interesting.
And, I mean, I think this is actually super relevant to editing in terms of style, I guess. Like when I was editing erotica and writing erotica, one of the things there is that language and what language is appropriate for different audiences was huge.
Yeah.
So when we started Clean Sheets, Yellow Silk was one of the magazines that was out there, and Yellow Silk was soft erotica, right? They would never use a word like cunt in the magazine, for example. And we had to have conversations at the beginning of Clean Sheets about what our language was going to be like. And, when people would ask us, like, well, what's the difference between erotica and porn? One of the things we talk about was there is, to some extent, sort of language differences in what's expected, right?
Yeah.
So for a hardcore porn magazine, they expect you to use more of the hardcore Anglo-Saxon four-letter words for their audience. And in a softer erotica magazine, you actually tend to use different words. I mean, there are no good words. It's all a mess.
There are no good words.
Everything's either, clinical or press, or like it's very hard to find words that are
cutesy or
it's hard to find anything that's neutrally sexy, right? Like
and that's what I was going to say. It's interesting about this, the potency of words. It's like expletives are like just the fact that it's grabbing your attention, and it's interesting how individual it is and how like specific to microcultures, because it's one of these things we habituate to. I mean, it's a strong stimulus, and it's one of these because it invokes a taboo, and either it's sort of like all the if you're around it, if you're in a culture where or a little subculture where it's very common, then it's like salt. If you eat a lot of or spicy food, if you eat a lot of it, then if there's no, it feels bland without it, But if you avoid spicy food, then something that somebody else finds mild, you're like whoa, and so it, it's one of those things, one of those strong stimuluses we habituate to, and it actually is. I expect that for the people reading Yellow Silk, it's a turnoff because it's too. It's all of it. It's too much, It's like it's gross. Then it's overwhelming. It's not a Whereas for somebody who is wants it earthy, then it would seem twee and that would be a turnoff. So it's like you have to calibrate the way if you're cooking for people, you have to be like, well, we'll make a spicy one for the for some people. And
are you when you're writing and you're choosing the language that you're going to use? What I would say is there's two levels to think on, right? One level is a market level about is there a place that you're pitching it to, and what is their market what's their audience going to want, right? And that's just like a pure market constraint, which you can care about or not as you want, but it affects selling, right? But then there's the artistic level where I would sort of say, well, use the language that your character would use, right?
Yeah.
So if she would think down there, then you've got to write it down there, even if you think that's ridiculous, right? Like, so.
Yeah, sure.
So that's sort of like interesting on an editorial level of like how you make these word choices.
But I feel like the first one, I don't know that the first one is purely a crass marketing thing, because I think not just with swear words, but with all kinds of things, there is like there's the distinction between realism and verisimilitude. There's what would I think that's a great place to start, is what would the character actually say. But there's a way you can be, and I have been in my career as a writer, too puristically wedded to my grand vision of what that really would happen in that world, and disdainful of the effort that it takes to get it across to a reader. And actually, I mentioned Charlie Finlay. Charlie Finlay, as a critiquer, it was the one who most potently, and I may have told the story before, it's one of my favorites, brought this home to me. I wrote a story called The Book of Jashar, which Stranger Horizons published. Well, you were there, Jed. The Book of Jashar, which is a pseudo-epigraphy. It's a fake book of the Bible. There's a book in the Bible, in Kings and Chronicles. They mention this book called the Book of Jashar, so we know Yashar. So we know it existed. And but we don't have it. It didn't come down to us. So many people as it turns out later, many people have written like their version of the Book of Jashar. So this is a version of the Book of Jashar in which basically David is dueling a originally Egyptian vampire who's now like secretly running the Philistine Empire, and so it's a vampire story, but it's written as if it's a book of the Bible. And like I'm somebody who like reads the Bible. So I really like the language. And so I wrote it like a book of the Bible. And I said it to Charlie for critique before he was editing fantasy and science fiction. And he said, I love this, but I am a like core fantasy reader who also almost went to like ministry, like divinity school. Like your market for this book is tiny. Like the market for this is tiny. That's just the market. That's just the market in marketing sense. The readership is tiny because, and he was right, most people will just totally bounce off this. Like they won't understand what the hell you're talking about because it begins with a half a page of begats. You know what I mean? Because that's how a book of the Bible begins. Ephraim begat Menachem, who begat. It's like, I mean, if you modernize the word begat, but like, it's like, of course, we're first going to establish the genealogy of the characters. And I just wrote it like it was a book of the Bible. So he said, what you have to do is give people the sense that they're reading the Bible, the richness of the Bible, without reminding them why they don't actually read the Bible. Like, like all the people who can't make it through, Chronicles on a Saturday afternoon because they're like, I think I'll sit down and read, a bunch of begats. Like those people are not going to be able to read it unless you. So there was interesting work to do to preserve the illusion that it was what the character would say. Whereas actually it wasn't really what the character would say, because what the character really would say would bore most people because it would be too culturally incomprehensible. So anyway, I'm just saying there's a spectrum.
That's what Toby Backel was on a panel talking about representing dialect, and he said basically the same thing, right? That, I think I want to say he gave a guideline of 10%, right? Of what it would actually be if you were speaking. He writes Afro-Caribbean science fiction. Well, he writes Caribbean science fiction, so the ethnic stuff gets complicated with Tobias Backel's work. But if he transcribed the dialect that his characters actually speak and put it on the page, it would be very dense for most readers who aren't familiar with it to get through, right? I think we have an interview on the SLF site with Nalo Hopkinson where she's talking about how she approaches this kind of issue as well. But I think
there's a slider. I think 10% is like 10% is like, that's sort of like, it's like with a lot of things, like where you're characterizing like how broad and mainstream are you trying to be, or how, I mean, if you're writing for a specific community, like sometimes there's a I don't know, I can think of contexts, like I believe that they were talking about this, I think on the podcast, See Something, Say Something, which is sort of used to be BuzzFeed and now it is Patreon driven. Being Muslim in America podcast. And, it's something that the host talks about, and that it was an interesting dialogue with Latif Nasser, who's from Radiolab and has his own show on Netflix now, and is so these were two roughly the same age Muslim guys in sort of radio podcasting, and great conversation. They liked each other, but clearly very different positions, where Latif is really used to being in like the broader world, explaining things. That's what Radiolab does. They're like, here's a thing, I'm going to explain it now. Like, it's a lot of explainer. And that, See Something, Say Something is like a place where, like, explicitly, like, I'm having Muslim guests on, we're not going to tell you what the Ummah is. Like, this is our show. You know what I mean? We're not going to stop and explain to non-Muslims every time we say something, and that gives it this richness and intensity where you can have this higher level conversation. So I don't know, that slider of like 10%, like there was a story published not too long ago that was like hella dialect, definitely more than 10%, and there was kind of like a conversation around it. And it's a trade-off. Like, you are making readers work harder, but they're also getting something for that because they're getting more of the unadulterated richness of this original context. And so you need to place that slider judiciously.
Yeah, and I think actually before I go on, can I make a technical note? Ben, it looks to me like your volume may be maxing out repeatedly. So when you speak, so is there an easy way for you to turn down the volume of your output, of your sound input?
Possibly. I don't know. I will investigate. Continue.
Don't spend too much effort on it. It may not be a problem at all, but it looks like it might be. So I was just going to say that I think that the question of audience and who you think the audience is really key, both for the editor and for the author. And I think, I guess this is basically just co-signing what you were just saying, Ben.
Well, you can give examples. I mean, like I'm thinking like Junot Diaz, and I'm thinking of
the Bone People.
The Bone People? Yeah, certainly. Thinking about what Faulkner does, and The Fury, thinking about the Borderlands La Frontera makes the argument by Gloria Zaldúa that she should not have to change her language in order to be understood, her Tex-Mex language, in order to be understood by the American academic elite, right? Recommend that book to everybody. And and this comes up we could do a whole episode about like should we italicize foreign words? Why? No.
Yeah, and what do you italicize? And
what are you marking as foreign, and for whom? Right.
Yeah.
And that moment in grad school where my advisor read my book and said, "Oh, you're writing this for white people," and I said, "What?" You explain everything, and I was and I had to go back and think who do I want to write this for? I actually want to write it for my sisters. I want to center them. So I have to be complex because it's a book about Sri Lankan American immigration, right? Like, so I want to center their experience and their reading. So it has to be complicated and nuanced enough for them and never bore them with me explaining too much.
Yeah.
So I think of it as concentric circles, right? Like that is the main circle that I write for. If I can fold in a little explanation with damaging that, great. Then I can go out another circle, and so on, right? And eventually I get to the white people, but it takes a while. Well, it's super interesting. Toni Morrison has an essay, and I'm sorry I'm blanking on the name of it, where she talks about the opening to Beloved, maybe one of her novels that she opens with this kind of like fade in view like of this Black village community, and that was added. It was added for white readers. Her editor kind of asked her to add it, and rather than dropping people and immersing them in the community at the beginning, and she did it, and I think if I'm remembering right, she was kind of conflicted about it. She sort of wishes she hadn't. And at the same time, doesn't know if she would have been successful if she hadn't.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I have no answers there, but it's a huge, and as an editor, I don't know what I'd advise her on that either, right? I think I would kind of lay out the options, and then this is right now what you have is throwing up a big barrier to a lot of the audience. You could do this. I don't know whether you want to. Here's like I feel like that would be my editorial approach to it. I don't know what you guys think.
I think that's reasonable. I also think that that you can present multiple options. Bone People being an example where she has a Maori glossary in the back. And if the reader doesn't happen to notice that, as I didn't, then you just have to deal with it. Sorry, I should say the reader who is not already familiar with Maori words. Then you just have to deal with them. And I found it readable regardless.
I did. I got a lot more out of it once on my second read, when I went back and looked up the Maori words as I went. And there was a lot of richness that I was missing.
Yes, I agree.
It takes a tremendous amount of skill to have it work both ways, I think.
Yeah.
Harry Hartman is an amazing writer, right? And won the Booker Prize for that book. And it's one of my 10 favorite books in the world. I'll keep recommending it in this podcast. So you've got to read it.
I feel like I run into this a lot, and that there's a whole range. It's a very rich and interesting thing, and there's a whole range of options in the Choose Your Own Adventure game that I'm writing, the Choice of Games game I'm writing, which is set in the shtetl. There is an early, very much at the beginning, conversation where the narrator essentially asks you how Yiddish you want it.
Nice.
And then throughout the story, so there's 3 levels. You could
That's
be
lovely.
there is a white bread level. There's a don't explain anything Yiddish level, and there's a intermediate. I vaguely remember Hebrew school helped me out a little level, and there's just sort of in my mind that's completely white bread. I don't know. I can't even. I don't even. Oi is a little much for me. The middle level, which is probably what I would have known when I was 15, and you know what I mean, and everything sort of. And then and then there's just a level where it's just as much as even if I just learned this researching, I'm going to toss it in because some people are fine going to the glossary and want the richness of being immersed. I like as a reader to sink or swim. I like to be flung into whether it's an imagined culture or a real one, it's a little bit like world, like how this is an analogous, although it's not the same thing, but this is an analogous thing with the density of information in science fiction world building. But anyway, and so for the Yiddish thing will be yeshiva. The regular one will be I don't know, Talmudic Academy, and then for the middle one, it's the first time I say yeshiva, I'm at the yeshiva where they study Talmud, or it'll be a righteous tzaddik, which is kind of redundant, but it's righteous tips you off what tzaddik means. You know what I mean?
Nice.
So, and in Dream Apart, this was interesting because there is a glossary.
Pause and point out, doing it is 3 times the work for you, right?
It's not really 3 times the work because in that particular context, because certainly not. It's not 3 times. The point is, I'm writing the word anyway. I'm thinking what the character would say. I write the word. It's a Yiddish word. And the syntax makes it very easy to just around that word. It's you know what I mean? It's ampersand, open colon, Yiddish word, bracket, half Yiddish word, bracket, English word, close brackets. So, I get what you're saying. On some level, it certainly is an additional overhead.
Translation work, right? You have chosen to add on. I'm not saying it's an overwhelming burden, but I think it's worth foregrounding that you have chosen to add on a set of translation labor to your writing of this project, and that most people probably would not take on. And it reminds me of, and I'll give it back to you, but it reminds me of The Sound and the Fury, which is quite complicated to follow initially if you don't know what's going on. And apparently Faulkner had wanted it printed in 4 different colors of ink.
Wow.
So that you could more easily follow it. And the printer, the publisher was like, that's way too expensive.
That's fascinating.
Wow, we should have a director's cut now of The Sound of the Fury with the.
I agree with that.
You could do a Kindle version, like an ebook.
Yeah.
It wouldn't cost anything to do that. Someone should do it. So Anyway, passing it back.
Well, yeah, I mean, I no, I agree. I see, I know what you're saying, and I certainly don't want to impose any burden on anyone to do that kind of translation labor, because I think that there is completely an argument. But also, I guess when I was saying it's not, I mean very personally for me, and it's like I am liberated by this praxis because it actually feels less assimilated to me because I'm not making the trade-off. I can just like. The fully Yiddish version can be way more Yiddish than I would allow it to be if I could only pick one. So the fact it doesn't feel like a lot of work. In fact, sometimes I'm sort of snickering at the like fallback white bread word. You know what I mean? It's like I'm like, how can I translate this to? And I mean, it's not. I mean, the story has to work on all levels. It has to work either way. But it doesn't make me feel like, oh, I have to do the burden of translating to the the goyim. It more feels like, this is great. I can be inclusive. You can pick your level, but like I do not have to hold back because I can have the version that's totally unassimilated. And in a way, it's not like I'm not a native Yiddish speaker, so it's not like I'm doing translation work in the sense that like it takes me a while to think of the English word. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's very much, it's a culture that I am connected to, but that is of course also foreign to me. It's a historical novel. I'm writing about a time that I didn't live through. So it's not quite the same as somebody representing exactly their own culture. It's my ancestral culture. So it's, I'm in the middle. I mean, I grew up in the middle level, right? I grew up hearing some of these things, but certainly not as deep dive.
It's interesting to me that you can do the full Yiddish. Like, I'm thinking for Bodies in Motion, I have little bits of Tamil sprinkled through.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of like, wow, it would be great if I could have written stories with the parents speaking the way my parents and their siblings actually spoke.
Yeah.
Which was a very full blend of Tamil and English with lots of people. And I could understand that, but I can't speak the language, and so I can't reproduce it, right?
Sure.
I would have to go find someone else who speaks fluent Sri Lankan Tamil and say like, okay, I'm writing down this in English, please translate it for me into that Sri Lankan English blend that I really have to ask my dad to do it, right? Like,
well, I mean, of course, in my case, even the Yiddish, I mean, they're literally in 1881, and they wouldn't be speaking any English. It would all be Yiddish. So, I mean, even the most Yiddish version is not as Yiddish as they were. It's just that it just allows me to use a precise term that I either have learned since I was 15 or maybe just found in my research for this work, where I'm like, oh, that's what they would have called it. I can use that very precise term and then also like define it at two different levels of granularity, And so anyway, I just think
there's a sort of a non-real fourth level in which you could imagine in which the entire story is in Yiddish.
Sure. Well, that I would have to get someone to translate. I would love to. That'd be great. Like if somebody wants to translate, if this is a big hit and someone wants to translate it into full-on Yiddish, I actually am hoping that somebody will translate Dream Apart. Dream Apart is not very long, that game. I mean, at least the play kit materials, and that would be amazing to translate into. I mean, it ought to be translated into Yiddish.
Ironic, right? That like Bodies in Motion has been translated into French and Portuguese and German and Tamil, not into any language yet, which makes me sad, right? Like I sort of want to pay someone to do the translation just so it exists, right? At some point, maybe I will do that. But I'm to bring it back to science fiction. I realized I'm reading something right now. Last night I was reading book 6 of The Expanse, and there's a big chunk of one scene in the Belter language, and that language has been sprinkled through the books all the way up until this point. But like there was always, it wasn't really Belters among Belters. There were always non-Belters in the room. Yeah. And so there was always translation happening. And it's only in book 6, like we now are having this big group of Belters having arguments, and they are just talking in the lingo. And I'm missing 3/4 of this conversation.
Interesting.
Which is an interesting choice on the part of Ty Frank and Daniel Abrams, the two writers who write as James A. Corey, I want to say, for The Expanse. And I'm like, at this point, book 6, I'm so invested in this. I'm not going to stop reading because of this. But it is a little frustrating. And I'm like, is there a translation somewhere? And it reminds me of when I was reading Dorothy Sayers, murder mystery. One of my favorite mystery authors. She has this trilogy, Strong Poison, Have His Carcass, Gaudy Night, that has a romance arc that culminates in Gaudy Night. And there's like the climax of the story is this moment where the main character gets a letter from her uncle that goes on for several paragraphs. It's in French.
Yeah.
It's like the whole letter's in French, and she just keeps going. And clearly, Sayers assumed that anyone
who could speak French.
Her book would also be fluent in French, right? Me, as a 12-year-old, was not. And there wasn't internet back then, and so now you can go and just go find the French translation online. And you don't miss anything. But
I imagine the same is true of the Belter thing.
Maybe they put it up. I don't know if they have or not. So we could ask them.
One thing that I think is hilarious, the thing this reminds me of, it's not directly related, but as somebody who lives here, I think this is puzzling for my kids, or was hilarious for them to realize that when you watch American movies, there is a convention that we are used to, that if someone is speaking, if on screen you are watching an actor who is playing a Russian who is in Russia speaking to other Russians, they are speaking English in a Russian accent, and we, as the reader, are meant to read that as if they were, or as the viewer, are meant to interpret that they are in fact speaking Russian.
Yeah.
Just as if in a musical they burst into song, we know that they're not actually singing, they're just happy. This is a convention that people speaking in a Russian accent are speaking Russian. But that's very puzzling to, I mean, it's like funny that translates. I mean, even in Black Panther, I am wondering, I had that question, even though I know this convention. A lot of the time I was sitting watching these conversations going, so they weren't colonized, so it can't be the case that they all went off to like Western schools to be educated, and so the elite all speaks to each other in English. This must actually be Xhosa, but then sometimes they're speaking Xhosa. So I don't know,
and there have been articles about Black Panther and Chadwick Boseman wanting to bring in African languages, and I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't have mentioned that because I don't remember the details well enough to.
Well, he was the one who I think I remember reading. I mean, they do have a lot of actual Xhosa, the South African language.
Yeah.
And the reason that they picked that at Chadwick Boseman's suggestion was because they were, I don't know what they were going to do, not have him speak, I mean, just use English or whatever. He was like, no, we need some. It's very similar to the conversation we were saying about like the book of the 10%. Bible. It should 10%. It makes you feel like it's real. You pepper it in to give it the flavor, but of course it can't all be in that. Although really some movies just go ahead. I mean, I in some ways would have loved to see a version of Black Panther where whenever Wakandans are alone together, they're just speaking Wakandan and we get subtitles. Like, that would be awesome. I love movies that do that, but it's a Marvel movie, so there's a limit. But
I wanted in when it was funny. Like I don't remember the specifics, but I want to say when the white guy's around, they have Shuri making snarky comments in Xhosa, right? So
possibly, yeah.
And
but they never subtitle it. I don't think there's anything subtitled.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Like maybe she translates for him or something. I can't remember.
Yeah.
They did use it as a humor device at various points.
Yeah, but I think you're just meant to read it as like when they're alone, we shift into this means they are actually speaking the language. We're just not being. It's as if it were dubbed.
The most interesting version of that I've seen is, I think it was in Hunt for Red October, when a scene starts with somebody speaking Russian and the camera does a tight close up on, I think, some Russian text and unfocuses, and then it refocuses and comes back out, and it's in English.
Wow,
and everybody's speaking
that's
English.
Great! Like explicitly lampshading the convention, like we are teaching. That's probably when Hunt for Red, that wasn't that long ago. I mean, but they're sort of unveiling the convention explicitly. It's just very funny, especially because if you live in Switzerland, you're used to seeing everything with subtitles anyway. So it's sort of like it's kind of like it's an odd peculiarity that Americans won't consume subtitles. From a
but I suspect people are getting more used to it during pandemic time. And this is sort of funny, but I'm watching a lot of Netflix and seeing what's popular and trending, and there's a lot more bilingual stuff.
Yeah, sure.
Interesting.
This is a great romantic family film with food, and it's in Spanglish, and it's very popular across America. And I'm like, I wonder how many people are now just reading the subtitles because they're so desperate for new media.
Sure.
And so
well, and there's lots of
and last month, like I've probably watched more things like that with subtitles in the last 2 months than in the 10 years before.
Right.
So maybe it'll change everything, which would be great. Right.
And there are a lot of national cultures that are starting to break out in that regard. I mean, there's like an enormous amount of K-drama on my Netflix feed right now. Like Hwarang is really good. By the way.
People are watching these Chinese films.
Yeah.
There's some big Chinese series that people were recommending.
The Untamed, something like that. Untamed.
Yeah.
Right, and there's a bunch of Indian stuff that's starting to cross over as well. So
nice,
and some like Mexican and South American.
We've gone far afield from editing. I think we're talking in one very specific aspect of editing.
So
we got stuck on the words.
Yeah.
I maybe this would bring us slightly back to editing, but I want to say something about one more thing about audience. This relates to something that Ben said in passing about science fiction in particular and science fictional words. And there was a story that we published in which the first couple of paragraphs were just full of made up science fictional words. And I often love that sort of thing. And I thought it was done carefully and well in this particular case. But we did get several readers saying, I gave up halfway through the first paragraph because there was just too much weird stuff.
So that's a good connection to, so when we workshopped together at WisCon last year, right, a year and a half ago, I think Ben maybe brought a story, David brought a story, David Moles, and I can't remember whose story it was, I think maybe Ben's. There was a breakdown in the critique group because there's a lot of coinage of new words, breakdown between the half of the people who loved it and the other half for whom it was too much. And I was in the too much category. Like, I want to say there's a term you guys were using, novum or something.
Yeah.
I don't quite know what that means. Do you know? Like, can you
well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean, but the novum, neologism is when you make up a word. Novum, I think, is more like when you make up a thing. So like but I think it's sort of like a science fictional novum is like the unit of like a thing that we're not familiar with in our world. That like so some kinds of older stories, like the sort of Campbellian story, would often have like one novum per story. It's like set in a world that's very familiar. Dad's sitting at the dinner table, mom's bringing in the roasted chicken, and there's like a novum. Like we have a robot butler. Like that's the one thing that's new. You know what I mean? And then there's a style that I am in love with, which is sort of associated with the 70s, and it's, Delaney and so on, which is, or, maybe to some extent Varley, and where it's like peppering with you, like eyeball kicks all over the place, right? Where it's just like
Novum meter pegged to the top.
Yeah, and
define eyeball kick.
So eyeball kick being like, I think an eyeball kick here, it means a dramatically noticeable, not necessarily novum, but like a flagrant flourish of like weirdness, like just a million new things in this paragraph. And I mean, that's probably even more the case in like Charles Stross, or you know what I mean, like sort of where it's even more so than where it's just like clearly having fun with there being 15 words in this paragraph, which are like almost a puzzle that you have to decode. And once there's a reward. It's like solving a murder mystery. If you're attuned to it, you can figure out all these things and interconnect, and it very densely gives you this entire picture of the world. You can deduce all these things that have happened in the backstory just by like puzzling out what these neologisms in context mean. But, like a locked room murder mystery, demanding exercise that only a subset of readers really enjoy.
Well, but I feel like this is related to things like the what we were saying about the Bone People, that it is possible to make it work on both levels. And I think that readers, maybe it's different kinds of readers. That there are readers who will take one of your paragraphs, Ben, and dissect every 3-word phrase and say, okay, here are 15 clues as to how this culture works, and they are all amazing and delightful. And then there's the reader who looks at that and their eyes glaze over and they say, I'm not going to read this story. But I feel like there may be a middle ground reader who's willing to say, okay, here's a bunch of technobabble. I'm just going to sort of slide past that and keep going.
Yes, and that's something I shouldn't act like. Yes, and in fact, that middle reader is very important. And if I'm specifically doing this, I'm really not pitching it. Yes, I'm pitching it to that middle reader in the sense that I want you to get, even if you don't figure out the puzzle, like that you should. There's at least one goal here, which is that it's emotionally legible, even if you don't know what we're talking about.
Definitely.
Like that you know enough, that you know what matters for the journey of the character.
Yes.
Even if you haven't gotten all the Easter eggs, as opposed to just a wall that's completely alienating.
It's making me, so when I first encountered Delaney, I was in high school probably, right? And I was reading Babel 17 and the collection of stories in, I want to say Stardrift, maybe? No, Driftglass. Driftglass.
Driftglass, yeah.
And at some point, Dahlgren and various others. And I loved them at that point. And it's interesting to me because now I still read and love his work, but I don't have the patience that I had at 16 when I had like nothing else that I particularly cared about getting done.
Yeah.
I had some stuff I had to do for school or for my parents, but this was the one thing I enjoyed. And so I kind of, what I was interested about Delaney is that it's like Delaney fast and slow. He's such a good writer that you can read it slow and get everything. You can read it fast and still have an enjoyable experience. Like that's what I talked about with it being legible, right? So I can reread now and kind of skim through in my harried way that, like working for kids, blah, 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 right? Kind of thing. It's very hard for me to slow down and read the way I did when I had endless summers with nothing to do, right? Like I can't even imagine. Like now when I read, there's always a clock ticking in the back of my head, right? And like I've got 2 hours to read, but I've got 20 things on the to-do list after that. Sorry, this is a side note, but
I think it's kind of a crucial thing. But I think that's also, I hope we eventually circle back to editing, but like high engagement and low engagement readers is also very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, in that workshop, I came in sort of feeling bad that I had bounced off the story because I was like, is this a failure of me as a reader that I wasn't willing to slow down and give it the attention it deserved and sink into the novum and enjoy it and so on. But I just wasn't. Like, it was the end of the convention. I was exhausted reading and workshopping, and I was like, well, this is my experience of it right now is I bounced off and I never got invested and I didn't care. Right.
I feel like this was actually 2 Wiscons ago because it was the one where Jackie and Anthony.
Yeah. It was that one. Was it 2 Wiscons ago? So yeah.
Yeah, it was 2 Wiscons ago.
But and I think Anthony was sort of with me, and then others in the group were like, no, this is all great. And I was like, I'm a bad sci-fi reader.
Well, it depends on the audience and on what audience you're writing for. And I mean, I read one of those Ben Rosenbaum paragraphs, and I often laugh with delight because there's just so much cool new stuff. Kip Manley wrote an essay some years back online talking about dilating doors. There's a famous science fiction sentence, "The door dilated," and Kip was talking about I think it's Ostranani. Anyway, a sense of strange, a sense of
estrangement,
that you get that is for some readers a lot of what science fiction is about. And in life, I am not a neophile. I don't like change. I like things to stay pretty much the same. But in science fiction, that sense of newness, those things that I've never seen before, are one of the things that I really, really love.
It's so funny. I'm totally a neophile in life. I love travel. I love eating new things that I've never tasted before. Like that's a great joy. I don't know why. Like I don't know. Like it makes me feel like I'm not very much of an intellectual in some sense. That I'm like I don't get in the same way that like the the puzzle aspect doesn't do much for me. Like, I don't sit around
I will say, I mean, this is a little teaser for our when we're going to do our talk about critiquing, but because one of my main models for how critiquing works that I took a while to develop, I mean, is precisely like that's the ideal critique group, is that you have somebody who it's just like, oh my God, this story is my jam. Like, that's exactly what I come here for. And then somebody else who is like a potential reader of the story, who is favorably inclined to what the story is ultimately trying to do, and who is like, these are the things that stopped me.
Yeah.
Because that gap is really what's interesting. It's not that you just need one of those or the other, because it's not just that you just need the person who had problems with the story and you need to go fix the problems, because that will get you an incoherent story if you fixes everybody's idea of what the problems are. But if you hold in your mind, like, oh, this is this person got the story I was writing. Like, that's the story I want someone to get. This other person didn't get that. So now that I know what the experience is that I want someone to get, what is in the way? What could I remove? It's sort of like what you were saying about the concentric circles and bodies in motion. It's like, what can I do to bridge this gap to the people who aren't my sisters? Whichever subset of those things won't make it worse for my sisters, those things I want to do. It's like, what can I do to let Marianne into the like flood of neologisms and weirdness without taking away from Jed's pleasure in them? That's where it's not a trade-off, where it's non-zero sum, right? Where it's sort of like, oh, this is actually a win-win if I can open this up and make more people see what this person saw,
So I want to note that this is reminding me a lot of persona-centered design in software, where you imagine users of perhaps fairly detailed users of your software. You might give them a name and a personality and a job, and the general idea is usually, as I understand it, that you want to have a main persona, a primary audience for your work, and you want to really please and delight them. You want them to get a lot out of this. You also have a secondary user of your software who you want to not alienate.
Yeah. Can we connect this to your day job, Jed? I don't know if you're.
Yes, I have been meaning for much of this conversation to jump into that and keep neglecting to. So the other editorial work that I do is that I am a technical writer, and for the last few years I have been explicitly a technical editor as opposed to writer. And one of the things that technical editors do is to act as sort of the zeroth reader of documentation. So we have to think about how some reader who is part of the audience that the writer has defined, or that we have defined with the writer. So in my case, for instance, we might be looking at software developers, and we might be particularly looking at software developers who are fluent in such and such programming language, or who are beginners with this technology, or who are experienced users of this technology, and that hugely informs what the text says and how we present things. But the writer may be, in some sense, a little bit too close to it, and the editor can be, when you're lucky enough to have an editor. I say lucky enough because I've also, as a tech writer, had editors who did an amazing job in helping me to improve my work. When you have an editor, they can act as a reader who is not completely familiar with everything, who doesn't have what's sometimes called the curse of knowledge, of knowing too much about the subject, and therefore not knowing how much of it needs to be communicated to someone who doesn't know that much about it. And the editor may not be an expert in the topic. In fact, generally isn't. But a good editor can nonetheless ask questions that can lead the writer to make the improvements they should make.
I have a question. So as you're talking about this, I feel like when I write nonfiction stuff and have you look at it, you are tremendously strong at helping me clarify things, right? And you're like, it's one of your real strengths is like, this sentence is muddy. It could mean this or this. Like, you mean this. Like, you get me to go through, or you just do it for me. You edit it into something that is crystal clear. And I sort of have been assuming that's coming out of all of your years working as a tech writer, where, much of what you're doing is removing these barriers and making things crystal clear so that people aren't having frustrating experiences trying to get the tech to work, right? Whether it's, I don't know if that's accurate or not. Okay, I'll let you talk in a sec. And you're very good at it. But it's interesting. So I'm thinking, like, is that my goal when I'm writing fiction?
Right.
Like, it usually is for nonfiction. Like if I'm writing, instructions for applying for an SLF grant, I want it crystal clear, succinct, easy to read, fast to read, etc. When I'm writing fiction, when I wrote Bodies in Motion, my sister-in-law actually said, oh, I was surprised it's an easy read. And I was glad. Also a little bit like, did I set out to write an easy read? I'm not sure. I wanted a murky, complex.
Well, she was the core audience.
I wanted to throw that out there as I think of Joyce's Ulysses, where
How dare you?
thing you've got to have the annotations next to you, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so I would say that my job, that part of my job as an editor when I'm editing fiction, is to tell the author, look, I could read this sentence 3 different ways. Here are those 3 different ways. If you're okay with that, then this is a great sentence. But if you don't want readers to read the sentence in this way, then maybe you could consider slight changing is my most common phrase that I ever wrote. I wrote a macro to be able to type that, abbreviate that phrase. Consider slight change for clarity.
I could have gotten some kind of email filter that when your emails to detentify your emails when they came in.
Change this, damn it.
That's right.
But yes. So to your point, Marianne.
Because I don't think I tentify when I edit, but go on. And I don't think I want to, but go on.
Okay. Well, and there is a difference. I mean, when a white man is acting as gatekeeper.
I think there are power dynamics in play where it's really good that you tentify, and it's probably better if I don't. At least, or depending on who I'm writing to. If I'm writing to a young woman of color, queer woman of color from the subcontinent, from Sri Lanka, then I should tentify because I'm in a position of power in relationship to them.
Well, and an editorial letter is also a work of communication that has an audience, and you should tailor it to your audience. I mean, that was a breakthrough for me as a tech writer, maybe, I don't know, 15 years into my tech writing career, and early in my time at Google, I attended a workshop where they said, so the first question you should ask is, who's your audience? And I thought, whoa, I never thought of that. And that's, informed my thinking about this stuff ever since.
Failed you, but
yes.
Because they should have ground that into you in high school, but go on.
But yes, so to address your point, Marianne, I think that there is enormous room for not being clear, but I want the author to be aware that they are not, I want the author to do that intentionally. I want the author
to be clear about not being clear.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. This is meant to be ambiguous. Well, and I'm thinking of things like ancillary justice, right? Which is probably very confusing to most readers for quite a while into the book. And it's absolutely intentional and kind of the heart of what she's doing there, right? So,
I went into it with a description from Naman. I mean, he was actually the one who sold me the book. He was working at a bookstore at the time, and he was behind the counter, and I said hi, and he said, you should buy this book. It's about and I said, okay, I don't have any time to read books right now, but that is so relevant to my interest that I have to buy it. And so I sort of knew going into it what to expect at that level, and it was perfect.
I want to edit that out. If it's
we will bleep that entire section.
I think that's a terrible spoiler for the book, and I don't want it on the podcast. So, Gary, I'd like you to go back and edit out what Jed just said.
I think rather than editing out, we should literally just bleep it. I went into the book and the person told me beep, and then we resume with Marianne saying.
I think it's a spoiler. I think it that undercuts the experience of the book.
I drastically disagree.
Episode about spoilers.
What, Jed?
I strongly disagree.
No, but I would not have had my experience with that book if I had known that going in. I couldn't have had my experience of that book, right? because I couldn't have been puzzled in the same way and surprised and made assumptions that were then undercut, that were then proven. My assumptions were proven to be wrong, and I wouldn't have had them if I'd known that in advance. So, and that for me, that's the brilliance of the book. That's why I thought it was worthy of the award. So,
for me, the brilliance of the book was elsewhere, and knowing that ahead of time helped me. I mean, it was my favorite book of the year. I loved it. Knowing that,
yeah, but I think you would have loved it regardless. And I mean, the fact that you love it is not really relevant to the question of whether that is a significant spoiler. Right?
I'm very spoiler sensitive.
To pull you guys out of that particular fight about the spoiler, I think there is a broader point here, which is that the readers. One of the things that I was naive about as a writer that I learned over the course of being a writer is the staggering degree, and with this touches on our thing earlier about like quality, but the staggering degree to which readers read different stories. And yes. I firmly believe that I write 50% of the story and the reader writes the other 50%. And I think writers react to that in different ways. And this is connected to the clarity discussion that I know writers who very much feel like the reader is mine. I am only going to leave them one road. If I know there's another possible interpretation, I'm going to wall it off. So I'm railroading you down my story. And I think that people who are good writers can be successful in just, powerfully pushing you in one direction down the story. But I kind of delight in the fact that I will write a story and I will intentionally write stories to split the crowd, particularly on the issue of utopias. I mean, I really want, I write a lot of stories that are either utopias or dystopias, depending on who you identify with and what you think is going on and whether you, and to what extent you're comparing it to our world. In fact, several, both the, Falling, the Guy Who Worked for Money universe and the Unraveling setting are both places where they are written in a dystopic fashion because it is a point of view character who suffers from the strictures of the society, because I feel like that's the interesting story and that is who to focus on, and because there's a moral imperative when writing a utopia to not present it as a pablum and to look at who suffers and the real cost of whatever you're proposing. And at the same time, both of the world building and the relish that I have in presenting the world partly comes out with an honest effort to think, how could things be better? From my point of view, not the character's point of view, but my point of view, I'm writing a story where 21st century me sitting here in the middle of this mess is longing for that world in which my character is suffering, right? And so I love splitting the crowd, and I love when writing a story like that, or regardless, that the reader is going to come up with is going to have and just also just totally different takes on things that I didn't see.
I like questions. For me, it tends to be. When I was writing erotica, I had a couple of stories that were centered around consent issues, and I really wanted to present a complicated situation that where people might have different readings of what's appropriate. In fact, this reminds me of yesterday you and I were talking about that Jennifer Cruzy novel, Crazy for You, which has this ex who is stalking the woman. It's a romance novel. There's an ex who's stalking the woman who's clearly meant to be violent and scary, but the male romantic lead is a little borderline in consent stuff. And Jed hated it. I thought Cruzy was doing something very interesting in sort of surfacing these issues, and that readers were going to respond to in different ways, and making visible these complexities around consent and force and gender dynamics and sexuality and so on. But I don't know. I love that. I generally do love that kind of stuff. It can be startling when a reader comes up with something totally not what you. There's a story in Bodies in Motion, Minal in Winter, where a young woman gets pregnant and is deciding whether to have an abortion or not. And a reader came up to me a few years ago, so more than a decade after I'd written the story, and said, so at the end, right, she has the baby and the aunt raises it. And I was like, that literally did not occur to me. Like, it was very clear to me when I heard the story that she had the abortion. But now I'm like, oh, I did not spell it out at the end. I kind of like it better leaving it open. I could see her having the baby and the aunt raising it. Like, let's Lady and the Tiger. Like, it could go either way, you know.
Nice.
But like I have to give the reader credit for that because I didn't come up with it, right? Like,
I mean, and counter reading a text is like a really crucial, like powerful thing that people do, right? And like a way that people, and also a way that it connects to conversations about representation. You know, there's this sort of thing about there's this interesting generational divide, or in a way, about queer coding, right? Where if you grew up in the Hays Code world where it was literally illegal, or at least widely agreed upon, not to show queer things, then like there's a way in which there was a way in which people embraced either implicit things that where it's nudge and wink that this is a queer text, or just that people are imposing, whether the author likes it or not, queer readings on texts. And you contrast that with the moment that we're in now, where it's like it is finally okay to say this out loud and have the characters have like the climactic queer kiss in a kids show, and so we have a real annoyance at queer baiting, at being sort of like, oh, well, you could read this as queer, but that's like, I'm not going to say it, or maybe I'll say it in an interview, but it's not in the show. Like, people are annoyed at that. And it's a very different cultural moment that when we were delighted both either to counter-read the trope in the sense of like deciding that Kirk and Spock are together, or to counter-read the trope into deciding that the villain is the hero, like to embracing, the queer-coded villain who's like their villainy and their queerness are connected, and to be like, yes, fuck you, I am a monster, like not gays and happy queers and fuck you, that like it's like, yeah, sure, Frankenfurter murders people, but hey, don't dream it, be it. You know what I mean? Like that is actually, I mean, Rocky Horror is actually a text which is counter-reading itself. You know what I mean? Which is like a satire of that kind of movie where there was a queer villain who the audience loves. Like Rocky Horror is in on the joke, but you know what I mean? Like there's that interesting and fruitful counter-reading. Just went on a jag, I guess.
That was awesome. I think we've got maybe 10 minutes to wrap up here. I feel like we haven't talked too much yet about the nuts and bolts of actually like what you think about when you're editing a short story for the magazine, in terms of acquisition, in terms of what kinds of changes you suggest. Like there's some like more hardcore editing stuff we could discuss, and we could fold that into workshops, right? Which we were thinking we would drag back one more time to talk about workshopping and teaching, because I think all of those overlap in terms of, what we start doing on the page, and, what like the kinds of editorial comments I give when I give them tend to be broad picture ones, tend to be about overarching themes, structure, character, etc. And I remember when we were doing a Strange Horizons workshop with Kelly Link as a guest teacher, Kelly was sentence by sentence. Like she was a very much like words on the page kind of thing. And I don't know whether it's laziness on my part, but I do that for my own work. I do that for poetry when I'm writing poetry or critiquing poetry. Which I try to avoid doing if at all possible. But I would not normally even attempt that kind of thing for short story or book length work editing. And Jed, you do line by line edits, right?
Yes. So, well, and going back to the culture of editing thing, there were times when we published somebody who was an experienced writer and had been published many times before, and who got really annoyed with me for trying to do line by line editing. So I think that that it really does depend on the editor and the author
I had the
and what
opposite
they're trying to
experience.
do.
I had the opposite experience because I sort of published a bunch with Strange Horizons and was used to having, delightful, like, long email chains in which we'd spend paragraphs on a semicolon, and which was, I mean, I loved the fact that you cared as much as I did about the shape of the story, and that the shape of the story really does live, and particularly because this kind of thing that both Jed and I like, which is a story where a few words of neologisms are suggesting a whole shadow backstory that the story's not actually going to get into, but just, the fact that I use this word rather than this word implies something about the last 10,000 years of human evolution. Like that. So individual words matter so much, and so there's a deep, rich, super fun conversation you can have about subtleties. Like The House Beyond Your Sky is the one I'm particularly thinking of, that we went back and forth on quite a bit, and that there were really, like, is it parakeets or should it be so the story told entirely in sort of metaphor, because it's set so far in the future that everything just has to be, imagine them as this, because there's no way that a modern reader could actually understand the thing we're talking about at all. And then it was something of a disappointment to me selling to other more editors who were in more institutional settings, making their living this way, not a labor of love, who would be like, yes, I'll buy it, here's the check. And I'd be like, where's the conversation?
Well, it's funny, the pandemic has changed my teaching, right? So I'm teaching asynchronously these freshman lit classes, and I've taught freshman comp before. And when you're teaching essay writing, you do the very, like, sentence by sentence kinds of work, right? You do like, you go through and, like, you take their thesis statement and you help them turn it into an actual thesis statement. You do outlines, you break it down into many steps. And when we have our normal in-person lit classes, I don't do much of that anymore, right? I hope they've gotten it beforehand. We do some workshopping at the 100 level, usually for the first paper, but there's sort of logistical strictures in terms of my time, right? Where what I end up doing is I put them in small groups. They read each other's work and give feedback. And I've provided some rubrics and we talk about some things generally. And I walk around the room, and if there's something that I see a couple different people doing, I might call the whole class together to talk through that, right? But it's not individual thesis editing for each single person. And because everything is being done, because I'm teaching asynchronously now, I was like, oh, I have the time. I can make them do this, where they all had to submit their theses. And we then, on Slack, and we had, like, rounds of back and forth editing on the thesis statement. And it was kind of, I felt that one student was like, missed the instructions and, like, just handed in her paper. And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm grading the thesis. So you can, if you're super confident, you can keep going, but you're going to miss out on all the stuff that the rest of the class is doing. And she decided to go back and just revise her paper if needed. But it was, and her paper was pretty solid. Her thesis was okay, but we made it better, right? I don't know. What is my point here? My point has to do with, we started this conversation a little bit talking about, like, what kind of editing doesn't happen anymore due to financial constraints, or it happens less than it used to back in the good old days when editors had a lot more leeway to do this kind of work. And I do think that's true. I think the markets have gotten tighter, and the pressures on the publishing industry have squashed a lot of the time that and budget that allowed for that. So it's in, like, one question I have is, where do people go to get that kind of editing now? Can they, like, do they just get it from workshops? Do they have to learn on their own? If there aren't editors like Jed willing to write paragraphs about a semicolon, right? Like, if you don't have that happening anymore, is the quality of our writing just going to get worse and worse? Or
here we are back on quality. I think that I think it's just different. I mean, in the heyday of the great editors, Thomas Wolfe and wow, can't think of his name. The editor who edited Wolf has been said to have been essentially a co-author, that, or maybe even more than that, that he made so many changes and such big changes to the work that he was shaping it. And my approach, I like to say, is more like being a midwife. I'm helping or sometimes maybe a gem polisher. I'm helping the author do what they want to do. And other editors have the approach of just stand back and let the author do what they're doing. And so it may, I mean, I prefer to have an editor involved in things, but we may be in a context when an editor doesn't do as much editing, you may get more of the author's voice. You may get more of what the author was doing in the first place.
Maybe.
But I think that's a slightly different question, because I think that you're looking at it from the point of view. I mean, there's the one thing to look at the point of view of like, okay, it's Thomas Wolfe, or it's, like, I think my understanding of what Marianne is saying is partly pedagogical, partly like, how does someone arrive at the place where, you know what I mean? Like, and I don't think that's necessarily needs to open up the absolute versus relative quality thing anymore, because I think it's partly about richness of engagement. Like like one I certainly profited from all the letters about semicolons, right? So that and of course I understand, what you're saying is partly like there is always an impact. So there could be a diluting effect or a controlling effect, or the editor is partly a gatekeeper. And, if the editors are doing a lot of shaping, maybe they're shaping it in a particular way. But the other thing I was going to say in response to Marianne's question is that, on the one hand, I think it certainly is true. Like, I've certainly, there are a lot of larger economic forces. One certainly, I was just talking to Annalee Newitz and Megan McCarran, who both write in, have written in like the, very successful at writing in the online world, like IO9 and Eater and, the BuzzFeed feed Gawker kind of ecosystem. And, the people in that ecosystem write they were sort of saying, sometimes we got people from traditional journalism who, were used to, could write great, but we're used to having a week or a month to produce an article, and we asked them to do 7 a day, and they were like, they broke. You know what I mean? There was no way. And that's real, right? Like like clickable media is a thing. Also, even before that, the consolidation and supply chain management bean counterism, which took out a lot of the sort of lovingly crafted individual publishing houses and turned them into parts of mega corporations, right? That was the great fusioning of the 90s that produced that famously produced a thing where people were like, I can't do developmental editing anymore because I'm spending all my time in meetings, selling with profit and loss sheets, convincing people to acquire this book. In response to which, I think a lot of agents did a lot more editing. Like, I think part of what happens is that agents became developed in that slice of the industry, which is sort of like big publishers. A lot of times agents are like acquiring books and doing a lot of developing editing before they sell the book, if they have time to believe it, and that's their thing. At least that's what a lot of agents will tell you, and I think that's probably a shift. But also, like, on the one hand, those are real economic forces, and there is certainly dangers, and I hope more places like Vox unionize, so they're not writing 7 articles. And I don't know,
yeah.
but at the same time, also there's a danger of being attached to the old norms of the past and being like, well, that was when there was, the editor with his feet up on the mahogany desk, penning words of wisdom to the gray-haired author was good, because there's so many other things happening now.
But
yeah,
I'll tell you, I'm struggling with this now personally. On the short story level, I'm fine because I can workshop stories. I've also been doing this a long time. So I mostly know how to fix my short stories. And then I show it to a couple of people in my workshop, and generally that crystallizes it. And I'm like, okay, I know where to go. Maybe I can fix it, maybe I can't, but it's clear to me. And I have enough information. For book length works, for novels, I feel like I'm having a hard time getting enough developmental feedback. And to the point where I'm currently like, maybe I want to hire a consulting editor, like a developmental editor, to work with me. And that's sort of a little shocking to me, because I spent so long in the field hearing the money flows to the writer, it's a scam to pay anyone to help you send it out, and then then the publishing house will have an editor who will work with you. But if that's not true anymore, right, or much less true than it used to be, I don't know, like, it's a question I get from writers pretty often, like, should I be hiring an editor to help me make my book better? Should I? And I don't know what to tell them, like, because I'm thinking about doing it myself, and I'm like, I have novelist friends who I could lean on, but that's feels like quite an imposition, right? And it's a big ask. So anyway, go on.
That I would call into question. Like, I mean, obviously there's lots of different solutions, and I do think that we should, and I do think that this sort of like money always flows through the author is a useful cautionary tale, because there are lots of scammers, but also comes kind of out of the days of the sort of Robert Silverberg, I type a different short story with each hand on two different typewriters and I never revise, and I send them out and then the money pours in 3 cents a word. I mean, that's a little bit, like revising is for suckers. But sure, if it's worth it to you, and like it's a partnership and there's lots of possible economic arrangements. But yeah. I want to raise a possible flag or concern about imposition, because I think that a lot of what should happen is that culture of critique that we have at the short story level needs to be broadened and expanded. And I think it's a mutualism. It's a community. It's not an imposition, or it doesn't have to be if it's structured right. And I really liked, this is the second time I'll mention Charlie Finley on this podcast, the Blue Heaven novel writing workshops. I thought were a great, back in the days when humans could be
I never went to one of those. Like, I was invited and I couldn't make it, and so
they were great. And there were a couple of spin-offs of them and I would like to see that like proliferate and become as common as Milford style short story workshops. It's really not undoable to have and I will since this is a good
talk about in another session, like I'm curious how you would organize it, how you'd set it up. I mean, we've done a little bit of this at WisCon in the past, so maybe we can talk about what we've done.
Let me maybe I'll just we could save it for another time, or I could just give the very brief summary of the rules now, because I do think we'll talk about it. We should talk about more in length later, but I think it was a really great innovation, which I would like to see catch on more, and I would like to encourage, which is that the Blue Heaven worked like 12 different authors. Everybody sent their first 50. And everybody read everybody else's first 50 pages. And then you were divvied up, and it was a week-long workshop. So, I mean, that's a luxury, of course. But, I mean, on the other hand, if you're writing a novel, it's, a good, months, if not years of your life. Like, maybe a week to do this is not such, I mean, of course, you have to have, I mean, there's obviously lots of childcare and travel and whatever. Like, it's not everyone can afford to do this. But on the other hand, it is, given all the hours that you're spending.
And I mean, right? one could probably do a virtual version of this as well.
Yeah,
right?
And there's certainly a virtual version of it. So what we did back in the day when humans could be in the same location as one another was get together for a week in rent a spot, and the first, I think, 3 or 4 days, everybody to everybody's, round robin, Milford style, everybody doing everybody's first 50. So you had and maybe synopsis or something. So you had like lots of people take on kind of the basic package that you would send an agent, first of all, and also like overview and tone and characters and would I even keep reading this book? And then you were divvied up so that you had like, I think at a minimum 2 other people and maybe 3 who read your entire book, and some people just tended to be glorious heroes of the revolution and gluttons for punishment, that they would end up reading 4 or 5 books just because they wanted to. And then the time logistics were done in such a way that it'd be like the next days you'd have one day that you just talked about, that these 2 people are just talking about this person's book. You know what I mean? You sort of have 3 days. I don't remember.
Do something similar. Yeah, I've been in a similar type workshop So I think it's feasible. I guess when I say imposition, what I mean is in the absence of setting up, a week-long getaway or a long weekend getaway or whatever, trying to fit into your daily life, asking a friend to read your novel and give you feedback, it's a big ask, right? My local writing workshop, what we do is we meet monthly for short story critiques, but essentially once a year you can have a book length work critique that we schedule a separate day for and give everyone 2 months reading time and say like, okay, this is the day we're going to critique Julie's novel. And that also works fine, right? So I mean, it's not like it can't be done. But what I want is to like say, Ben, I just got back this feedback on my novel Friday, and I really want you to read the novel and the feedback, and then have a 3-hour conversation with you about it. And this is all true, but
example taken from life.
Right, but you have a life, right? Like you can't necessarily fit that in the next week, right? Or the next month. So
yes, obviously it's harder. It's a harder problem of scale than short stories, but I'd still think that we as a community should try, in the sense that like it is partly like a like a lot of things about communities, it's like a stepping up and investing in each other kind of conversation. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't know. I mean, one of the things that's difficult is that just logistically scheduling. Like one of the difficult things about Blue Heaven was like, has everybody at the right stage of their novel at the right time that it actually makes sense in May to do this? So you have to have a large enough pool that there's a certain number, and then some people are like, well, mine's not quite ready, but I guess I'll, I mean, but yeah. There's certainly lots of challenges in doing this, but it feels like, and there's certainly nothing wrong with, you can also be like, okay, well, I don't,
let me I'll clarify the imposition thing one more time. One other aspect of it is that I'm thinking of the way that Nnedi Okorafor has sometimes talked about how she gets a lot of African writers who kind of expect her as the famous African scientist to read their work and give her feedback, and she's very busy, right? And she
of course,
over and over again. And when I think about like, well, I would love N.K. Jemisin to read this novel and have come. And Nora and I were friends, casual friends, and like we've had meals and cons together. But that's a big ask, and I do think it's worth thinking about the power dynamics and who gets asked to do this a lot. And who it's hard to say no, and so on. So anyway,
of course. And there's a lot of analogies to like, it's sort of like there's a it's like a short story. Also in terms of like acquisition and magazines and stuff, it's like a short story is a one-night stand and a novel is moving in together. I mean, or at least a longer relationship. I mean, when you ask somebody to do this, that's a very, it's inappropriate for people to randomly drive by and be like, I like your work, read my novel. That's inappropriate in the same way that it would be to show up on somebody's doorstep. It's like, can I sleep with you? You know what I mean? Like, you maybe buy me a drink first. Like, I don't even know you. You know what I mean? Like, I think that, there are the same, maybe this is a weird analogy, but there are the same, it's obviously lots of ways people's feelings can get hurt if they overestimate or underestimate the degree of commitment in a relationship. Like, this is like the emotional level here is real. And like, if you ask somebody to read your novel, you're asking them to have a serious connection with your life and devote hours of emotional and artistic and labor and everything. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, and I'll pay you. Like, you know what I mean? Like, do you do editing? Like, that's perfectly reasonable. And some people do. And like, probably the best place to start is with your friends who are like, well, I don't have anything for you to critique in return, but like, I'm, need the money, right? I mean, that's fine. Like, we shouldn't demonize that. But I just think also,
Minal Hadratwala is a writer who we did an interview with at the SLF that we're going to be putting up in the next day or two, which is why I'm mentioning it now. It's on my mind, but she does consulting work, and I'm seriously thinking of like finding out what her rate is and asking her to take a look, right?
Well, and we should,
I mean, I think that there are, I think that you don't want to pick the first random stranger who has an ad on the internet saying I'll edit your book for you. But I think that there are very good editors who you can hire for this sort of thing. I think that some of them are coming from the world of professional book editing and have been laid off, or various other things have happened and are no longer working at a publisher, but still have all that experience. A friend of mine writes poetry and recently hired I think she used the word book doctor to basically be a developmental editor for a book of poetry, and thought the experience was wonderful and got a lot out of it.
Meacham was one of my Clarion teachers, and she's been an editor at Tor for decades. And she just announced that she's retiring, but she may do a little consulting editing afterwards, right? And I would totally hire her.
There is another aspect to this, which I think everything we're saying is I would like on the one hand to normalize and legitimate like people making all kinds of arrangements with one another and supporting each other, and like on the other hand, I do think that sometimes when people are saying money flows for the writer, they are not saying this editor is a scamster who is exploiting you. They are saying this is not a good structure for the industry. This transfers risk from publishing houses to individuals. This is part of like Uber, right? It's like instead of you getting an advance, and as part of that a commitment to edit your work and so on. And so what you've done is your job is you wrote a book, then you sent it to somebody and they took on the risk because they're a corporation. They are investing the money in both you and the editor to make this happen because they as a corporation are betting their money on this, and they have enough of a fund that they can tolerate risk. It's pushing it to the writers, which of course means that writers who have a lucrative day job are in the position to acquire these services, and writers who aren't. So it's part of the gig economy proletarianization of you know what I mean, of sort of like you're an independent contractor, you take on all the risk, you pay for all your editing and bring us a polished manuscript is an ask that the publishing houses are making. And I think a part of the objection is not to the editors who are just also trying to get by, but to the publishing house being able to outsource this risk to the community of publishers and editors and only buy it once it's done. That.
So, like, in some ways, I feel like writers kind of got off easy for a long time compared to many of the other arts, right? Like in lots of visual arts, performing arts, etc. Like artists spend masses of money on headshots and acting classes and all of this stuff as a sort of default studio space. And maybe because there was a relatively small pool of writers submitting to the science fiction magazines in the 50s and 60s, right? There just weren't that many. So maybe Campbell had to do a fair bit of developmental editing to get things to the publishable stage, right? Now, with the advent of the internet and the democratization of all of this, there's a flood of writers, right? Like the number of people who are trying to write and submit stories, I would guess, is much, much higher. And so it's easier for me to say, like, well, I'm going to put together an anthology and I know I'm going to get 20 publishable stories that I won't have to do any editing for, right?
Sure.
Maybe that wasn't true 50 years ago. So
yeah, I mean, that's partly true. But I think there's also, I mean, yeah, but on the other hand, when we say writers had it easy, it's sort of like, I mean, I think it varies from art to art. And I think it's interesting how there are infrastructural, political structures. I mean, one of the things somebody was telling me about having gone to, I think maybe it was Liz Argall, who had gone to, who we were hanging out at Worldcon, so the Hugos, and there are all these lifetime achievement awards and whatever of and it largely we're talking about, when we talk about people who are renowned, with some exceptions, we're talking about novelists, right? So the people who came up in a time when they were writing novels, that's their IP, they were selling it to a publisher, they got an advance for it, and then they got royalties on it if it did well. Like that was the business model. And she had just been at the equivalent comics convention where the Eisner Award and all of the similar things in comics were handed out, and the Lifetime Achievement Awards and whatever, and also the both at WisCon and at the Eisner Award, the sort of in memoriam deaths. And it was brutally evident that comics writers die 10 years earlier because they don't own their IP. Like that was her thesis, and I thought it was pretty strong that like these two industries had sort of developed in parallel, and the way the comics industry had developed is it was dominated by a duopoly of two corporations that basically what was on offer was work for hire, and then you could have like indie projects where maybe if you're the Hernandez brothers, you could cobble together a small press and publish your own thing. But really where most of the money is for most of the working writers was DC and Marvel, and you didn't own anything. Like the guy who came up with Superman got like $100 and that was it. Whereas the writers who became eminent, so eminent writers were living on starvation wages. And the writers who became eminent in the novel writing world, of course, a lot of people didn't make it. But those people who did, they actually owned the thing. And they actually, you know what I mean? And just the stark economic difference between the ways those two like sets of writers had developed in parallel had like a measurable impact on their lifespans, which was, you know, really, really kind of fascinating.
I mean, I'm not arguing against you that I agree that the risk is being transferred to the writers, and that's bad. Like
I don't know what to do about it. I mean, I'm not saying I know what to do about it, but
I'm not sure how to fix it given the globalization. I mean, like part of how it's being fixed is in things like people who are bypassing the publishing industry and selling direct to the reader,
Sure.
you know, Kindles and Amazon and, you know, whatever else. There are all these other models developing, but I wonder. Yeah.
Although again, those do transfer risk. Like it is. And I mean, this isn't a problem that you can solve just by individual action. It is an interesting, and I'm not even sure it's a problem you could solve by. I'm not even sure this particular problem lends itself particularly well to regulation. I'm not sure I want the government to, you know, require. I mean, I would like them to force Uber to act like a cab company. I mean, I do think that there is a good amount of like antitrust and regulation, but in this particular instance, I'm not sure that I even know.
If we had basic income. I mean, like if there wasn't such an overall wealth disparity,
sure,
everyone had a base floor, then people would be freer to invest time in editing. Or do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think we're in a yes. We're in a sort of weird transitional economic moment, and that's sort of like there's sort of a brave new world of like maybe it will work. Maybe like on a far larger scale than Andrew Yang envisioned it. Maybe we really get to the utopia we were promised in the 1890s, where you know there's a like you could just assume that wealth is going to flow to 20 individuals since everything is automated in the world, and simply redistribute half of that and give everyone completely full salaries and let them do whatever they want, and the world would definitely bloom and flourish. And we're sort of like, that's like Star Trek Federation, maybe? I don't know, or I don't know how it works in the Federation. Maybe there's not 20 wealthy individuals. Maybe it's just all owned by the Federation. I don't know. Maybe there's no money. Anyway, there's like that.
There's money in the Federation. Ian Banks' The Expanse. Ian Banks
the culture.
Ian Banks' The Culture versus The Expanse Economics is a podcast episode I want to do, and I want to bring Alex Gurevich on and talk about economics with some real grounding. So we'll table that and come back to it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, my point is just that there's a gap between that and then like in the moment that we're in, and that, you know, where that's not necessarily going to. I can't press a button and make that happen. There is the conversation of like, how much do we resist? I mean, you know, there's it reminds me of the conversation about like, you know, free internships, where like a lot of places there's a developing norm. Like for a long time, a lot of industries ran on just like people should come intern here for free. You know, we're amazing. There's a million people who want to do this, and there's sort of at least at a minimum, a social opprobrium for like not paying people for things. And in fact, it's in the context that you and I had this conversation about, like, I'm on a board that's volunteer, and you have made strong arguments that like nonprofit boards, like that gets you an upper middle class board.
Yeah, I would say as well, like nonprofits have traditionally bridged some of these gaps, right? And it's not really a solution, but it helps, you know. So when you look at something like, I mean, the grants the SLF gives out currently, you can apply for the grant, and if you get the working class writers grant or one of the diversity grants or the travel grant, you just get $1,000, and you can take that $1,000 and hire an editor with it, right? So, or you could pay your rent. I mean, we leave that up to do whatever is going to best facilitate your writing is our goal, and we figure the writer knows that better than we do. But we could, for example, I mean, as we were having this conversation, I was thinking like we could specifically reach out to an editor interested in doing developmental editing, and then have that be a thing that we give out, right? That you apply for this particular thing. And if I look at like the Illinois Arts Council and grants that I've applied for and gotten, like they give grants for professional development. And so I got a grant from them, which gave me a couple $100, which I used to pay my fees at Ragdale, the writing residency program, right? You can also use it for things like hiring someone to build out your website, right? Like, so it has to be specifically professional development. And I think that would be an interesting model to start bringing into science fiction more, because I don't think it's so much here yet.
I like that it was somewhat specific, but also somewhat flexible there. I want to quote in regard to a lot of this stuff. Colin Kaepernick recently wrote a piece on an entirely different topic for Medium, in which he said systemic problems demand systemic solutions. And I feel like even if we're not going to have the government requiring publishers to provide editing, that things like SLF provide ways that we don't have to have individuals reinventing solutions to this problem all the time.
But it's a bridgy stopgap. I mean, it helps assuage the worst of the inequities, but just in terms of scale, we're only going to help a couple people, right?
It's true.
So.
Yeah, I think with all of these, there's many of these things, like, I don't know, we're evolved to live in communities of 150 people, right? Like, we're really only meant to think about the Dunbar limit of people. And so, and then we have a world of 9 billion people to build. So very often when you confront these social problems, there's this weird gap between like you have to think about both. You have to think about like the grand solution that ought to happen and just talking about it and pushing. And there's various layers on which, like, just coming up with it, and then like when it's a radical and defined idea, normalizing it, and then like when it's beginning to happen, pushing behind it, right? Like there's that whole very long, complex process that requires millions of people, and then there's like your individual action that you can do in the moment. And I don't know. I guess I would propose the following 3 or 4 pronged strategy, which is I think we should normalize and demonize at least like the idea of paying an editor. Like that shouldn't be like we shouldn't have this, purely like that's always a scam attitude, because that is like a legitimate form of work, which has, in fact, it is simply a fact that has been debundled from what publishers used to do and pushed into this gig economy world. And like, we can't pretend that didn't happen. So there's a lot of, so that is completely legitimate for you to do that. At the same time, like the other balancing thing of that is I think we're allowed to be mad about that, and being mad about the gig economyification of it does have some social force. Like it is, in fact, if we regard publishers who still do that as awesome and publishers who don't as kind of cheesy, that if that becomes a social norm, that does have an effect. The same way that, and particularly if that was, I don't know, like sometimes concretizing and materializing those things, like the idea that if you pay 7 cents a word or whatever it is now, you are a SIFWA Pro publication, and if you are under that, you are not. Like simply, I don't know, establishing some kind of like visibility of like, these guys do developmental edit, like Erewhon is doing developmental edits on the Unraveling. They are cool. Like that's just that being a social norm has an effect.
I don't know anyone making that visible. Like, when Black Hole came along and they started tracking response times from magazines, they changed the field, right? Because
also when Broad Universe tracked like and whoever else did that tracked like diversity numbers of like submissions and how many exactly.
I don't know anyone tracking who does developmental editing.
That would be really an interesting thing. I mean, that would be maybe that's a cool project for the SLF. I think sometimes making these things visible, because the social norm does matter, and prestige, publishers care about prestige, and like everyone just sort of complaining that no one does developmental editing anymore is like a eulogy, but like actually making a distinction between are you doing developmental editing has a potential effect. And then the third thing I would say, so there's like, it's fine to pay for it. We shouldn't necessarily have to pay for it, and let's like pray, let's like let's like have that be a conversation. And the third thing is that also having a, you know, communal life that's outside of that's a third force besides the government or the market, you know, is really, really important. Like having there be ways that humans relate that are not based on either coercion or an exchange economy. Like where a gift economy can thrive is like really important. And so one of the things that's wonderful about Milford-style critique workshops for short stories that have established themselves in science fiction and fantasy as this thing is that it is a gift economy. It is like open source. It's like a place that and of course people there's slimy critique circles, and I'm not trying to make it a romantic paradise, but that is a force in the world where we say this isn't part of the exchange economy. So I really like, I know it's hard, speaking to the audience, I know it's hard to schedule time for novel critiques and whatever, but don't see it as an imposition that you're nagging your friends. See it as you part of a cultural tradition of civic society that goes beyond simply what we pay for or what, you know, someone imposes.
Yes. No, I agree with all of that. And in fact, like that third leg is a lot of what I'm trying to start developing at the SLF with the Portal In project, right? We talk about it as like Khan Academy for creative writing. Like, I recently went to go check whether Khan Academy was already offering creative writing classes. They are offering, they've just started offering some lit stuff, which is great. And they may do creative writing eventually, but we're going to be doing it faster. But the idea, like what we heard, like a few years ago, I sort of surveyed on Facebook and so on, like what do writers want that they are not getting right now? And the main thing they said was in-person community, which the pandemic made that a little harder. But like, I think those of us who go to conventions and have, you know, can afford to go to conventions and so on, it kind of brought home to me how many people feel very isolated where they live, aren't able to travel, and aren't able to put together a local writing workshop or don't know where to start. Like the very basic idea of like, you know, go to your local coffee shop and put up a flyer saying, it's like, call this number if you want to like join my writing workshop, which is potentially opening you up to much creepiness. So you would be a little careful, right? But like people didn't even have that model, right? Yeah. And so I think there is a lot that we can do with, you know, we've started creating local chapters, which are virtual at the moment, but will be in person again at some point. And I'm envisioning this web of connections and where we can normalize a lot of this sort of stuff that if you go to conventions, you'll learn this and you'll meet people and you'll get invited to Blue Heaven or whatever else, right? Like right now, I think a lot of people are very shut out of those economies, right?
I would, yeah, go ahead, Jed.
And don't know how to build them themselves. And so like, I think there's a really good place and a scalable place for the SLF to foster that and provide models. So anyway, go on, Jed. You were going to say something.
I was just going to say that I think that we are verging on out of time, and that I thought that seemed like a good ending point. But go ahead, Ben.
I do have one other thing, because you said there's not a thing, and there are other things. Because going to conventions is great for those who can afford it, but I also think that a lot of like personal circles of writers who know each other and like each other's work and critique each other came out of during the era when critters.org and the online writers workshop, which I think is, I just went to critters.org. It's still there. I assume the online writers workshop.com is still there. And I think there was, I remember like being on those sites, finding that really useful. And then at some point peeling off because like I knew enough people, but like, I think that kind of thing still exists and is really useful. And another thing is that like, I think one thing that's true today is like that there's also like fan fiction, which, and we were talking about this before, but like to some extent, like professional writers, like there's a way in which I'm jealous of the searchability and discoverability and like amazing, like a fine-grained ability to find like particular like niche interests that connect people on things like AO3, right? Yeah. So and that is a great training ground for like learning craft and everything, right? So there's and making connections. So I think there's although I'm sure that's also it's probably an art to like having the right set of tags to like connect with the right set of people. You know what I mean? Because there's so much there that of course it's easy to get.
I think it's also love. Like our first step would just be telling people about critters in AO3 because most people don't know about them, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that don't despair if you can't make it to a con. I think there are also online spaces, and that those online spaces, even if they start out as big and anonymous or whatever, often create relationships that then become more close personal networks, and that's a natural evolution. And I guess just that's that making the effort to sort of find each other and forge connections is part of what you can do as an individual, even though it is, of course, a systemic problem. But creating, networks of community where writers support each other, because the thing is that it's not like developmental editing is a good I don't know, refined uranium. This is a thing that we could we could do. Editors are, of course, a different breed than writers. Not every writer is a good editor, and there are if you're lucky enough to have a true editor who's really good at that is a beautiful thing. But 80%, a lot of what you learn as a writer, critiquing, a lot of what you have to learn to make your own story good is also what you have to learn to make someone else's story good. So there really is a way in which it's a pretty accessible good for people to do for each other.
Yeah, I think maybe that's a good way to transition to next time, because I do want to talk about the ways in which writing workshops and critique groups and whatever get it wrong and lead people badly awry. So I'm not sure I'm going to agree with that 80%.
Maybe not.
Well,
it's really only 79.
Potentially, it could be negative. Yes, I agree. We will tell lots of horror stories and talk about lots of anti-patterns and failure modes. I'm not saying right out of the box. I'm saying if we learn to do it right, we are capable of 80% of what a great editor could do.
I think that's true.
And training people to be better critiquers and better developmental editors can also help.
Yep.
Right. Finishing up, Jed, do you have any last thoughts that you didn't get to say because we talked too fast and too loud during this? And then at the end of this, we can just have time where he says...
Yeah, I think we should. I think we should reserve the last
30 minutes for all the things he didn't get to.
So I think having just a minute at the end to say things that didn't come up is fine. I have two things in particular that didn't find a way to work in. One is the importance, the usefulness of style guides, which is something that I do more in my day job than outside. But I think that it relates to various things that we were talking about. That making decisions about what your publishing house wants to do for style, and also about what this particular project is for style. Sometimes an editor will call that a style sheet rather than a style guide. Is really useful. And if you make that decision and write it down, then you never have to make it again. It helps with consistency. It helps with a lot of things. The other thing go ahead.
It's efficient. I like efficiencies.
It is efficient. The other thing that I was going to say was a quote in the context of porn versus erotica and sort of styles of language and that sort of thing, that there are a variety of different ways of working around what style of language is appropriate to your work and your audience issue. And the one that came to mind is a quote from Dashiell Hammett from The Maltese Falcon. "The boy spoke 2 words. The first, a short guttural verb. The second, you."
That's funny. I think my end comments that I didn't get to say, one of them was way back when we were talking about the kids listening to stuff with lots of swearing in it. I had wanted to say something about one thing that fascinates me is when they first started watching TV, which sometimes had swearing. Kevin and I had this conversation about do we want to let them have unfettered access to the internet? Do we want to, keep them on the kids' channels? And we ended up sort of, I was allowed to read anything I wanted in the library. So we ended up kind of following that same path with the internet. But we did kind of say to the kids, just because you're hearing it on TV doesn't mean you're going to start talking this way at home, right? And they agreed that they weren't going to start talking that way at home. And And in fact, they haven't. And I think it's fascinating to me how good they are at that. I'm not sure if it's quite code switching, but sort
I
of
think
like
it counts.
code switching, that they're like taking all of this in, they understand it, they can parse, this, YouTube gamer or whatever who's swearing a blue streak. But none of it's making it into their spoken language with us or with their friends, right? Like even when my son is like video gaming with his friends, he's not breaking out into a lot of swearing, right? And so I just think that's interesting in terms of, I don't know, when you're thinking about how you switch language at various points.
Yeah.
And then
appropriate to circumstances and audience.
Yeah. And then they have more facility with it than I would have expected. And the other thing was, we talked about sort of like obscuring, challenging novums in science fiction-y things. We didn't really talk about fantasy and the ways in which some of the fantasy tropes can also be barriers in a similar way. So, and the one I'm specifically thinking of, because I see it in writing workshops all the time in college, is I'll have some students who are not genre readers, and I'll have some students who adore high fantasy. And I allow them to write fantasy in my class. So they come in with a story that has 20 things capitalized in the first 3 paragraphs, right? That is like extremely off-putting to my non-genre readers. Like they just kind of like check out and turn off and have a really hard time engaging with everything else that's going on in the story. So I think that's just a little bit of an editing conversation, a warning, sort of, think about. And I understand the impulse. I grew up on Tolkien and I love it, but it can lead you astray, or it can limit your audience. Maybe that's a lot of it. And also that, like, just because you capitalize something doesn't mean you've actually done all the work of making a rich culture and whatever else. You know what I mean? Like
that's a whole other big topic.
They get used shortcuts, but they're not effective, right? So anyway, yes, it is another big topic. So maybe something to pick up another time.
Yeah, that's a big topic.
Any last thoughts for you?
Well, I just have to. I mean, I just now feel obligated to chime in on the cursing and kids subtopic. So, because I have a funny thing about that, which is that I feel like I had a code switching thing growing up that like I don't think I cursed very much at home. Like, but like I had a sort of a foul-mouthed crew. I mean, it's an evocative and exciting, so I, like, as an adult, and as a teenager with my friends, like that was just sort of it was very much a code switching, like a mode of like, of affection too, of like giving each other shit and, bonding through like salty language was very like expressive part of that sense of connection. But I didn't associate it with home life. And so when I had kids, I think it wasn't like an effort or anything. I didn't curse at home because they're little kids. You don't want your little, yeah. I mean, not everybody feels this way, but it was natural to me not to want my 3-year-old to be cursing like a sailor. So I just didn't curse around them. It just seemed natural. And so, but now I've had a really funny thing where like my kids are very rigorous, moral, and abstemious by nature. And like they are very, like they're very sincere and earnest. I mean, they're fun too, but like, you know what I mean? Like they do not, but the funny thing is they've reached I mean, I don't think this is true of Noah. He's listened up a little about it, but no, Aviva doesn't curse. And I think she's like you. I think partly now she's off at college and she could curse, but I think I completely buy that scenario that she would try cursing and her friends would be like, oh yeah, no, that's not working. But I think she wouldn't even, because I think she just identifies as like, that's not me. And and she's very much herself. But the funny thing is that for my kids, there was this kind of implicit agreement that we don't curse. And then like I reached an age where they were teenagers and suddenly it didn't seem, you know what I mean? Like I let my guard down. Like I just started talking the way I talked when I was a teenager and they were like, nice. Daddy, you can't, like they were constantly
like I'm not swearing, but I think like in the last year or so, I haven't censored myself if I want to say something like kick-ass, right?
Yeah,
it's not
right.
It's got the word ass in it. And if I say that, like she's a badass, my daughter will be like, "Mommy," you know.
Yes, they would get very annoyed at me. Exactly. Like, I mean, now they're kind of resigned to it, but they got very annoyed at me because I was sort of violating the social contract. Like, we don't curse, and then all of a sudden I was. So all in our family, all of the conversations in which someone was telling someone else not to curse was definitely my kids telling me not to curse, not the other way around.
Right. Okay. So totally unrelated to editing.
It doesn't have anything to do with editing. I just thought I'd throw that in there.
There you go. So, all right, I think we'll wrap up there. So, thanks everyone. We've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully, somewhat interesting, and we're going to make Jed come back at least one more time to talk about workshopping and maybe like getting a little more into the concrete nitty gritty of like, I don't know, like what do you do when you're editing? I feel like there's conversations about how do you start fixing structure, or how do you like address voice? What do you actually do to make it better? So maybe we can do some of that. I feel like we should have like an example, like a story that we're gonna like. Here's a bad story. And, like,
actual play.
Yeah. So, well, we'll see. That may require too much homework, but all right.
Critique group Twitch channel.
That's right. All right. Okay, that's it. Signing off. Mohanraj and Rosenbaum are humans with Jed Hartman. We'll be back. We don't have a catchphrase yet for.
That's our catchphrase.
We'll be back.
We don't have a catchphrase yet. No, the catchphrase is we don't have a catchphrase yet.
That's right.
I think you should stick with like we do human stuff.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good catchphrase. But although it might be better at the beginning than the end, I don't know. But
yeah, okay.
We do completely human stuff like humans, which we are.
All right.
I'm going to start calling it Mohanraj and Rosenbaum are allegedly humans.